All right. We have folks from Munich, Germany, La La Land. I guess that's LA, where you are, Cap. Franklin, Tennessee, not far from you, Dan Teeter, which is awesome. And Greater Nashville. Thank you very much for letting us know. And thanks everybody for joining. This is the AutoMobility Advisors webinar on EV residual values. That's our conversation today. We have some special guests as well from our team and from the Electric Drive Transportation Association as well. So interested in talking about electric vehicles. Before we get too much further, I just wanted to kind of set the table and talk about the industry and what's going on with the industry. It's obviously got a little uncertainty and turmoil at the moment. But before we do that, why don't we introduce our speakers? So my name is George Ayres. I'm the Managing Director of AutoMobility Advisors, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you for joining on your lunch hour if you're in the East Coast. If you're in Europe, thanks for your pre-supper meeting time. And if you're in the Central or Western time zones, I guess it's breakfast or brunch. So thanks for joining. And thanks for being here. I'll turn it over to Dan Teeter for introduction.
All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm Dan Teeter, the Advisory Director at AutoMobility Advisors. Look forward to the discussion today.
All right. And Alan?
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Alan Levenson. I am the Director of Data and Analytics with AutoMobility Advisors. Previously worked with General Motors and Asbury Automotive Group. Very excited to be here today.
Thank you. And Cap?
Hi, everyone. Cap Shah, Principal Consultant at AutoMobility Advisors. Thank you all for joining.
All right. Thank you. And Genevieve, last but not least, sorry about the technical difficulty there. Glad to have you.
No worries. I'm glad to be here. I'm Genevieve Cullen. I'm the president of the Electric Drive Transportation Association. We are a coalition of the entire EV value chain, vehicle manufacturers, components, materials, electric utilities, and infrastructure stakeholders. And we are happy to be part of this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, let's talk about the state of the industry, for example. We have some obviously turmoil right now with the tariffs happening, not happening, depending, and that's causing some issues. The ironic part is, of course, the car market is actually doing really well at the dealer level. March and April, sales up quite a bit, but we have some uncertainty. I saw this morning Cox Automotive talking about the SAR, which is a very industry term, seasonally adjusted annualized rate, or the sales rate for the year, which is forecasted now to be about 16.6 million units, which is really good, right? So it was 17.7 in March. It went down a little bit in April, and it's planned to go down a little further because nobody knows what's going to happen in the back end of the year. But car dealers are actually selling cars right now. Prices are starting to go up because inventory is falling, and et cetera. So we have EVs in the midst of all that, right? They're trying to kind of be in the midst of all that and trying to understand how those market dynamics are going to affect EVs, I think is an interesting discussion. And then along the way, we have average prices of new cars rising. 47,462 in March was the average price of a new car. The average used car price, 25,180 in March. But globally, the EV market's growing, right? Globally, it's grown 29% in April. 1.5 million cars sold in April alone. 29% January to April globally, EV market growth. So, but then we have tariffs, but we have rebates or, sorry, EV incentives also changing, right? And Genevieve will get to that idea as well. But why don't we start first with maybe any comments about the market itself and where we are right now? Why don't I turn it over to Cap? Tell us a little bit about your point of view about what's going on in the market right now, and therefore the context of EVs and residual values in that space.
Yeah, George, and that's a great question. And I think the simple answer is who knows, right? I mean, but really what it is that there's a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty. Of course, with the looming specter of tariffs, with a number of other things that are going on in the industry. There's a lot of challenges that face the broader industry, but EVs specifically that we'll talk about more in our webinar here. But obviously tariffs is the main one, but there's so many other factors that make a huge impact on the auto industry and for EVs in particular. Anything from fuel prices, recessionary concerns and recessionary risk, all sorts of different things that we'll definitely touch on here.
Great, thanks. And Genevieve, if I can go to you, I think it'd be interesting to hear your point of view on what your members are saying, right? What your companies you deal with are thinking about right now before we kind of dive into the residual value topic. What's the general feedback that you're hearing?
Sure. Well, here's, I think any conversation, we've already said it several times, but any conversation about vehicles and vehicle policy starts with the word uncertainty, right? There is that because there's so much variability in the policy marketplace that folks are finding it hard to make real projections. But here's what's solidly true. Amidst all this uncertainty and dynamism, or whatever words you want to say, the data is showing a trajectory of growth. The electrification is the path forward for transportation. The question is speed. So we're seeing the EV market is continuing to grow, as you pointed out, and particularly globally. Sort of near-term policy hurdles, create a little uncertainty in the marketplace, but investments in the manufacturing, in the tech and infrastructure are continuing to move forward. And the question is just how fast.
Yeah, and I mean, my state of Georgia is got battery factories getting built and new car factories getting built, all kinds of things. So, all those arrangements were made some years ago, right? Those incentives were out there and now they're actually happening and things are starting. And I think that's going to carry on, right? Regardless. So, okay, why don't we dig in a little bit to the topic of the day here, which is residual values and kind of how we figure out the value of electric vehicles. I guess that's the main idea, because we think they're different, right? We think they're different fundamentally. But before we do that, maybe Cap, if I can lean on you again, tell us a little bit about, from your point of view as let's say a student of that marketplace, what the history of using leasing is, for example, which means we care about residuals, right? If we didn't have any leasing, we'd have new cars and then we'd have used cars and there'd be a value on those used cars and we'd still have the same situation. What is the value of an EV as a used car? But leasing is a particularly unique idea that was born, many decades ago, I guess, and has still been used and is being used, especially on EVs. What's your thought about leasing in particular? Cap?
Oh, apologies. Yeah. So, George, that's a great question. For leasing, there's two real main perspectives to look at. There's the consumer's perspective as well as the automaker perspective. Why it matters for consumers? Well, frankly, there's a lot of obvious things, right? They want a combination of a low car payment. They want ownership in a defined warranty period. They want to be able to know that anything that goes wrong with the car, the entirety of their ownership, it's going to be under warranty. They turn it back in, get another car that will be fresh, have a warranty behind it the whole time they own it. And there's also a lot of small business owners that prefer it for accounting purposes. Yes, they can always straight line depreciate by purchasing a car, but it's just something that's simpler for them to be able to get their mind around. Now, for automakers, it's a little bit different, right? I mean, for automakers, the obvious one as well is that it just creates a predictable sales cycle. You lease a car, you come back in 3 years, and you will have an opportunity to see what's new at that point and walk out with another brand new car, right? So there's that predictable sales cycle. People who lease a car are more likely to use the captive finance arm than those that finance. And some of those that purchase may even just buy it out cash. Now, on top of that, there's also the whole secondary market, right? So as we talk about residual values and resale values and all of those things, there's no used car factory, right? There's no one builds used cars. The lease returns is that used car pipeline, right? So if automakers want a CPO, certified pre-owned car, sell cars as CPO, they need that supply of near new lease returns coming back in. So that's something that has a lot of value for the automakers and the dealers. Now, for EVs specifically, there's a lot of different dynamics, and we'll get into that here. But there's a lot of consumer apprehension around EVs, and having a shorter holding period for the consumer, they can get a taste of it, right, for 24 months, for 36 months, and they can turn it back in if they're not feeling comfortable with it. There's also the obsolescence risk, right? So the later version of that EV comes out with more range, a different plug that can use the NACS plug at Tesla superchargers. Maybe in 3 years they decide, hey, okay, I want to get the latest model so I can use the latest and greatest features that this car has, right? So there's a lot of that. And frankly, again, for the automakers, there's also something in it for EVs specifically. They need to hit those sales targets on EVs specifically for fuel economy, emission standards, and regulatory reasons. And also, frankly, having such a large EV tax credit, dividing that over 24 or 36 months versus dividing it over finance creates a more outsized impact and creates a better value proposition versus if someone's coming in trying to finance an EV.
Sure, sure. Super. And Alan, I'm just thinking about your experience as a retail leader in a publicly traded dealer group for a while. So you saw lots of different stores, how they operated, retail versus lease versus even fleet, right? And sometimes people confuse fleet and leasing in some sense. Lots of fleet sales can depress prices, right? OEMs at the OEM level. How do you think about the leasing as an idea and therefore residual values as an idea being important to dealers?
Sure. The dealers, as Cap mentioned, as a general rule, do like leasing. And for them, even sometimes more than the OEM, they do get that benefit, direct benefit of not only the customer coming back frequently, but also getting that used vehicle that they can certify and have on the used car lot. So as a general rule, most dealerships like leasing. Now, obviously, as we know, certain manufacturers have a much higher tendency to lease. So depending on what brand you have as a dealer, you're going to have more or less leasing.
Yeah, my experience as a luxury car person showed that that's what we did, right? A lot more of our sales were leases when you're selling
Sure. I mean,
$90,000 cars.
Yeah, I mean, leasing tends to be heavier, with luxury vehicles by definition. A much more expensive vehicle, the lease payment is lower than a traditional finance. So that certainly is one. What we see is brands that have good residual values have a tendency to lease better than others. When I used to run an equity mining company, and so we were always looking at this. And I would see, so several years back, BMWs having often 60% residual values after 3 years versus back then, some Chryslers at like 40%. So that just has an enormous impact on what that lease price is going to be. So you would certainly see those brands. The finance companies generally don't want to lease to subprime customers because the finance company, the captive, is keeping that vehicle on their lot, on their balance sheet. They've got the risk. So brands that have a tendency to do a little bit more subprime, maybe Mitsubishi, Kia, others that have lower priced vehicles, generally you'll see less leasing. But where they can, I would say dealers do like getting that customer back pretty quickly.
Sure. I know EVs started out, of course, at the high end of the market, right? Most EVs were expensive. First Tesla, for example. EV prices are starting to get closer to regular internal combustion engine prices. yes, the average car is 47,000, but the payments, let's say, are not that far apart anymore because there's many, many more vehicles, right? Genevieve, there's 171 current EV models sold according to the dashboard that you provided me with the updates. So that's a lot of different choices, right? Really interesting. I remember in my experience trying to get luxury cars leased. When we launched a new car, one of my jobs was to go to Santa Barbara and talk to ALG and try to talk up the price of the car, right? Or the value of the car to try and build that residual so that right out of the gate, when we sold the car, it would have a higher residual, right? But that's before sales actually happened, right? So that's a prediction. I saw the other day that Cybertrucks, they have 10,000 Cybertrucks sitting around right now, something like that. And in fact, they changed their policy from not even accepting Cybertrucks as a trade-in, which is ironic, to now they will. So Tesla's wrestling with that pre-sales value versus what happens after you start actually selling cars for a while, and the demand happens or doesn't, right? And what that does to affect it. But yeah, I think some of this is predictive, right, Cap? This is predictive type stuff. You got new cars and new models coming at you, especially EVs, and we have to kind of figure out what that is. Genevieve, I'm wondering about your members again. They're focused on selling electric vehicles. Some of them also internal combustion engines as well. But how do they think about when they launch these new vehicles, how they kind of tell the best story to get that best, let's say, prediction of the value of it? How do they think about that?
Well, I think an important thing to keep in mind, as you said, 171 models. They're talking to a lot of different customers. And part of the story of the growth of the EV market is based on the fact of the proliferation of choices like price points, capabilities, that the obviously different vehicle manufacturers are aimed at different audiences, and whether it's the luxury segment, it's the pickup trucks, or it's the family SUV, or whether it's truly less about sort of the people who are making like a socially conscious choice in their vehicle. I think people are just trying to make it clear to their consumers, like, what do you want your car to do? And this can do it for you, but faster, cleaner, quieter.
Sure. Yep. And Dan Teeter, bring you into the conversation. You have a lot of experience in the OEM world, in particular in market research in OEMs, but also with the introduction of Nissan Leaf, for example, and the early days of EVs and low range, small car, new to the market, and then kind of worked all the way through that. So you watched the OEM kind of deal with internal combustion engine cars, EV cars, what the difference is. What do you see as kind of the challenges the OEM has as they change their balance, right? They're adding more and more EVs, maybe less and less ICE vehicles. They have to do more things on the EV side of the ledger than they used to do. And what are those kind of things? You've seen that from the beginning, so I'm just curious about your views about where we are.
Yeah, thanks, George. Yeah, it's been an interesting evolution on the EV side from what started off as a California-only requirement in order to sell cars that would take a Ford Ranger pickup truck bed and fill it up with batteries so that an automaker could comply to the start of hybrid electric vehicles, and then to the straight battery electric vehicles like the Nissan Leaf and then the Tesla, and how that has snowballed now to 171 different models. That's a big change in the dealer body. So I'll address that aspect first. Selling EVs, as Nissan learned and as other traditional OEMs who have had a full range of gas vehicles have learned, it's a different proposition. There's different selling points. There's different types of customers. There are the early adopters of EVs who end up being quite different than the later on customers who buy those products. and dealers need to be up to date on what it takes to convince a customer to come in, take a look, to sell some of the unique features that EVs had. For example, for Nissan, when the Leaf came out, that was Nissan's first real telematics equipped vehicle. And that was needed to help manage that ownership experience when the vehicle could only go 85 miles or so in range on a full charge. There wasn't much of an EV infrastructure that existed for charging stations. So having to have tools and guides within the navigation system to help you find a compatible charger that's along your route so you can get to where you're going. And then having dealer personnel being able to explain that to the customer was sort of a revolution within the dealer body and a big change for customers. Over time, we've seen a lot of those maybe barriers to entry start to dissipate, as EVs now are about 10% of the US market. And then there are some brands that are exclusively EV, like you have with Tesla and Rivian and Lucid and some others. That has helped raise the overall awareness level. You now see chargers in many different places. But vehicles now, if they're an EV, they have a different lifespan, a different service expectation, different touch points for them to come back to the dealers. There's not a 3-month, 3,000-mile oil change or a 6-month, 7,500-mile oil change to get those customers back to the dealers. And the cars can last longer than a gas car. We've seen estimates of 18 years versus 12 years for EV versus gas, assuming that the battery lasts that long. So far, the battery lifespans have been pretty good. They drop some range initially, but then they plateau and level out, and customers can't expect those vehicles to last a long time. That changes the dynamic. At a dealer, it also changes the expectation for residual values, because you now have a different, simpler type of car as an EV that can have up to 50% longer lifespan than a comparable gas vehicle.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of issues in there. So let me pick a few out, right? So, I think EV battery warranties are 8 years or so, right? I think that's the case, which is longer than your traditional powertrain warranty, we used to call it, right? Powertrain warranty. So the OEMs are basically saying, yeah, sure, it'll be fine for 8 years, or we'll pay for it if there's a problem. But it's a big part of the car, 40%, I think, of the price of the car, right, Cap? Something like that. So the battery itself has a long-lasting effect. There's a battery management system. We've seen that, right? When new EVs come out, sometimes they're, I'll call it, tuned, so that they don't necessarily provide all the range they could provide, because they're trying to be conservative as an OEM, right? So I'm always thinking about, okay, over-the-air updates could retune the battery management system as a used car and unlock that leftover range, right, that could be there. Because sometimes in a used car mode, 3-year-old car, 4-year, 5-year-old car doesn't have the range as the new version. But there's ways of doing that. Now, there's issues there, right? So the new owner has untapped range that you're not letting them get at, and the used owner gets maybe more range than they would have otherwise gotten. So who benefits, right? There's ways of thinking about that. But there's a lot of issues in there, I think, and I think it's really interesting to watch how EVs develop. My wife and I have an EV. We leased it for 3 years. We're 18 months in, so we're halfway in, and I follow the maintenance book religiously. And it says at the moment that I don't have to go into the dealer. I haven't been into the dealer yet in 18 months, which is very unusual. All the other cars I've had in the past were sure would have been to the dealer by now. And that's simply because of the miles on the car. It's just not high enough yet for having it checked. But, that kind of stuff I think is really interesting. And then, I think that drives how dealers behave, right? They're used to the old systems. And in my experience, and when I look at dealers, I see, maybe 20%, sorry, 1/3 really EV excited and putting charging stations in and doing all kinds of things. 1/3 not EV excited at all, and 1/3 in the middle, right? So Alan, just back to you, as dealers kind of wrestle with all those issues, how do you see them changing and adapting to this new technology, new customer type, new sequence of servicing, off lease, used EVs? How do you see them dealing with that?
Sure, happy to address that. And I saw there was a question about in there about dealers early on not necessarily getting on board. Listen, dealers have their comfort level, and anything that's new obviously is a little bit more difficult for them. They're pretty focused on providing their customers a good experience. They're pretty focused on making some good profitability. And anything that's new is going to be a little bit questionable. It requires training. Keep in mind, salespeople have a tendency to churn at a fairly high rate in our industry. That's been an age-old problem. So, getting the training out there on the product, getting people comfortable and willing to put their customers in something new. The fact that we have seen used car values have come down on EVs does give them concern, because they have customers out there now that are driving, and folks, particularly those that did finance, with negative equity, which means getting them into their next vehicle will be difficult.
Yeah, we've seen
there has been
84-month loans, for example, right? Which to me, it just blows my mind that people would do that. But, they're trying to do what they need to do to make it affordable, right? I understand that.
Early on, of course, EVs were, much higher priced, so that made it a little bit more difficult. Now with all the variety, and, you're seeing some, Chevy and other products in the low 30s, and with the good lease prices, as well as the federal subsidies, which who knows how long they're going to stay, but that either $7,500 or $4,500 has certainly helped. And so, we're seeing a lot more mass market products. We're seeing better range products. So the dealers are getting much more comfortable with it. And, we are seeing some of that penetration increase as a result.
Yeah,
and also, it was an investment. I think Dan mentioned they all had to put some chargers at the dealerships. Still not an insignificant cost. Some of the OEMs helped offset the cost. But over time, more and more of the dealerships have made that investment, and that will help a lot.
Well, let's turn to what we think is going to happen, right? So you mentioned incentives, EV credits, and that kind of thing. That's a whole area, and Genevieve, I'd like you to comment on that if possible. But also, I saw the other day, maybe today, Mary Barra at GM saying that they're going to push back on California's mandate, right, to go all EV by 2035. 11 other states follow California. I saw Maryland or somebody else already slowing that or trying to do that locally. And then in Europe even, they have the same idea, 2035, to get rid of ICE vehicles, and they're getting a lot of pushback. So there's a lot of noise in the market about slowing down that EV adoption thing. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that, and as well as the incentive, let's say, expectation, and where we're going to get to by the end of the year, maybe.
I think again, our old friend uncertainty. What's pretty clear is that the current administration has pretty much painted a target on the sort of the suite of incentives that are promoting electrification. So that's that tax credit for new EVs. There's a tax credit for used EVs. There's a commercial credit that also includes leasing that dealers can take and share with their consumers. And there's an infrastructure credit that's tech neutral, but it covers 30% of the cost of a charger in your home or your business. So this has been a very effective suite. It also includes upstream to manufacturing. That's another issue, another webinar perhaps. But all of those have been a target to be used as a pay for other priorities that this administration has. So that looks in the bill that the House Budget Committee just voted out this weekend. is they would end all these credits by the end of this year, with the exception of, I think they might tweak it again, but in the most recent version, it did allow an extra year of the credit 30D for you tax nerds, for small volume manufacturers, so that vehicles whose have sold less than 200,000 cumulatively would still be eligible through next year. I don't know if that survives the House, because everybody's got their own machete. So that's looking extremely vulnerable. But at the same time, there's a whole bunch of process and a lot of folks to satisfy before this churns through the Senate and finds its way to the president's desk. So
Yeah.
I think lots of things can change.
All right, thank you. And also, let's get back to residual values themselves, right? So CAP, when we did the white paper, which I'll put a link in the chat for everybody to download if you haven't done so, white paper on this topic, one of the things I think you described very well was EVs are different than ICE vehicles because there's some benefits that you get by having an EV, right? Some even driving benefits and other types of benefits beyond even the tax credits, right? 7,500, I think, was the new credit, 4,000 for used. And so, how does that change how people figure out what the residual values are for an EV when there's a new owner set of benefits, but they're not carried over to the used owner, the second owner, right? That doesn't stay the same potentially. How do we think about that?
Yeah, George, that's an excellent point, and it's actually kind of a multi-layered issue because effectively, as you mentioned, there's a number of benefits, I guess we could say, both cash benefits and non-cash benefits that apply to the first owner of the EV, right? The obvious one is the federal tax credit, but there's also a host of local, state, and even utility company-based incentives that also apply. Notably, a place like Colorado, where there's so many incentives that some cars like a Fiat 500e are advertised with a zero payment, right? That's a little bit not the full story, but that's the kind of thing that you see when there's just a ton of incentives that apply to the car as brand new. Now, you can take all those incentives and split them out over the 24 to 36 months and create an absurdly low payment. And that will get people in the door and they'll want that EV, right? But what happens is that the vehicle, when it comes back, is not going to then sell again for $100 a month or something like that. What's going to happen is that, if you go to let's say, for example, if you go to the lot today, if you're in a state like Colorado or somewhere else and you have a really low payment, under $200 a month to lease that car brand new. But if you look at a CPO version, right, you might buy it for also a very favorable price. You might get it for $20,000. But you take that, used car and then you do a 60-month finance and you're talking about hundreds of dollars a month. You're talking about 2 to 3 times as much to buy a used vehicle versus leasing the new one, right? So that creates this really big sort of dichotomy between that new and used affordability, right? So there's some major issues there, but it's not just the cash, it's not just the price. There's also things like the HOV, high occupancy vehicle, aka carpool lane access, that apply to the new cars, at least for now. That's starting to get phased out as well. But that used to apply for the first 3 years of the car's life cycle, which basically tends to overlap with the lease, right? So there's an added value that the new car buyer got when they leased the car that the used car buyer, it's no longer part of the deal, right? So that then has to come out. That has to be taken into consideration. So all those advantages of the new car are then sort of in effect depreciated out of that used car.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. No, that's great. Thank you very much. It was also mentioned, I think, Dan, I think you might have mentioned infrastructure as well. And I'm just thinking about more infrastructure means it's more encouraging for EV adoption, and therefore the demand goes up, more models are introduced, et cetera. Less infrastructure, less encouraging, right? How does that, just one idea, and maybe Genevieve, you can pick up on that as well, that investments in infrastructure, which we saw happening, drive, let's say, that EV adoption and therefore demand and therefore pricing as well, right? Dan, maybe you can give us some ideas about infrastructure as it relates to EV and residual value.
Without any infrastructure, then there'd be no demand for these products. You look at some of the hydrogen vehicles, there's no infrastructure for them around the country, so they can't get sold around the country because what can you do with it? And that's what EVs were trying to build at the same time they were making the cars. So you had some OEMs working with third parties to create charging networks, other OEMs making charging networks themselves, because they knew that the gas stations of today aren't equipped yet, although many of them are converting over, to be able to support the driving demands of an EV buyer, and that you can't just have home charging as the only place to get your vehicle charged if you want to use it beyond just a very local errand running type vehicle or commuter type vehicle. So the charging challenge has been one that OEMs and innovative companies have been trying to address. It's something the government has been trying to address. Genevieve mentioned there's been a variety of incentives in place to help encourage the buildup of sufficient infrastructure so that people aren't going through this calculation in their head when they're considering what to buy and excluding an entire category of cars because of the ability to keep it running when you travel beyond 100 miles from your house. So that building up of that charging infrastructure has been going on now pretty aggressively for the last decade and a half. And it will need to continue to do that for another decade and a half to be able to catch up to where gas infrastructure is today. At the same time, those companies are building out new charging stations around the country. They need to be upgrading old charging stations around the country that are starting to fall into disrepair. Some estimates show that up to a third of those existing public charging stations no longer work. That kind of performance isn't going to encourage any first-time new convert into an EV to want to stay in an EV because it just makes it too hard. You've got to get rid of the frictional losses, make it as simple and easy and better of an experience than what you can get with a gas car in order to get people coming back and growing the market.
Yeah, if that high percentage of your gas stations were out of gas every time you stopped there, that would be an issue for most people. Genevieve, what are your
Hey,
members?
George,
Go ahead.
could I just add one additional point to I think is pretty pertinent here. As you think about the whole range anxiety, which has been an issue for really since the beginning of EVs, one major component to solving that is the range getting longer, and we're certainly seeing that versus the 50 miles on a Leaf. You're now seeing vehicles routinely over 300 miles of range, and quite a few over 450 now. So that goes a long way. The other point is the speed of recharging is enormous. And, several weeks ago, I think many of us saw, BYD out of China talking about several hundred miles of range in 5 minutes of fast charging. That's a game changer.
Yeah.
And when you can get the ability to get several hundred miles of range at the same amount of time that it takes to fill your car up with gas. Now, again, we have to have the vehicles capable of doing that, and we have to have a lot of those chargers. But that's a game changer for really driving EV penetration.
And to pick up on that last point, I saw an announcement by GM Battery Technology. They're talking about lithium manganese rich LMR, lithium manganese rich batteries, 400-mile range and lower cost, right? Last year, we were talking about solid state batteries were kind of the next thing. So now here's a new thing, lithium manganese rich. But then, of course, you got to go get all those, those materials, right? That's part of the geopolitical problem. So Genevieve, I want to let you comment on the infrastructure side, just because that's obvious that, I'm sure it comes up in your group all the time, where infrastructure is, where it's going, what the limits are, where we need more of it, right? People that have a home charger like me, my car's full charged pretty much all the time because I can plug it in every night if I need to, right? But not everybody can do that, multifamily housing, et cetera. parking garages. So what are your members saying about that whole topic? How do they think about the charging as it relates to the growth of EVs, the demand side?
Well, as Dan rightly pointed out, well, this build out of charging infrastructure has been going on for a decade or so. That's that's a blink of an eye, and sort of this in taking on a sort of 120-year-old incumbent internal combustion engine ecosystem, right? And there are some technology changes that are happening fast, which is good and also complicating, right? So as noted, right, what people thought, what car makers thought consumers wanted, they're like, all right, the 80% of consumers drive less than 40 miles a day. Hence the configuration of those early of the
Right.
Leaf, right? That they were basing it on, like, well, that's pretty much what everybody needs. But it turns out they weren't right about that. But what they need is exactly what they want. So people want their car to be able to meet all of their needs all of the time, which is so adding range. So it's bigger batteries, which adds costs at the beginning, right? But battery costs are coming down, but so you can carry more of your energy all the time and finance it in the beginning, right? Essentially you pay for your power first. And there's also the combination effect, which I think is going to play a bigger role than people are assuming in the plug-in hybrid piece, right? So people get the certainty to have a backup gas engine, and folks are reconfiguring plug-in hybrids too to create bigger battery range. And going back to the original Volt, right, which was just used the internal combustion engine didn't provide propulsion in theory. It just charged the battery. And folks are looking at that again to sort of avoid the cost of having to put more sticks in the ground. But at the same time, more sticks are going in the ground and way faster. When we talked about fast charge, 10 years ago, that was 50 kW. Now fast charge is 350 kW.
Yeah.
That's a major difference. It's 20 miles a minute of charging. And that is game changed. If you think of, like, if you're going to drive 400 miles, chances are you're probably going to stop for 20 minutes somewhere along the way. But there's also lots of changing going on in the sort of level 2 and even trickle charge, that there are folks who have like curbside charging businesses. So it's going like micro and macro. So there's a lot of moving pieces. And this is this industry is still sort of a toddler. So it can be sort of hard to manage.
Yeah, agreed 100%. And just to close out the charging topic, I like Tito's comment in the chat. Everybody's seen, hopefully, the charging challenge more and more is not about charger availability, but the charging experience itself. We went from range anxiety to charging anxiety. I think that's true, and we need to kind of fix that as well as an industry. Let's go back again to the supply demand and its effects on EVs and residual values, et cetera. Cap, this one's for you. I think a few months ago, we did a webinar and a white paper on the, let's say, soon to happen Chinese EVs coming to the US, right? We talked about China EV experience in China, China EV experience in Europe that's already happening, where they're taking lots of market share in terms of EV sales. And then they're looking at North America very closely, right? Regardless of the tariff situation, whether they build in Mexico or Canada, et cetera, we think that China EVs at some point will be here. Knowing what you know about how they do it right now and the quality of those EVs, the technology that they have, the range they have, how do you think about a bunch of Chinese EVs, new brands entering the US marketplace in the next few years, and what that will do to the value of EVs?
Yeah, I mean, George, it's a very rich topic. I mean, effectively, when we talk about these residual values, it's always a matter of supply demand economics, right? But it's also a matter of what's your next best alternative, right? So if you can get a brand new, less expensive, if it's a Chinese EV or whatever else, but there is a less expensive EV that does, the kind of range and whatnot that a more expensive EV can do, it puts a depressive effect on the used value of the other EVs that are comparable, right? So that's an obvious one. But to the point you mentioned, as we know, they're held at bay in the U.S. right now. That's not the case in Europe and the UK and other parts of the world where Chinese EVs have all but flooded the market and are just, like a tsunami, are just coming on. There's more and more models with more and more technology, still maintaining excellent price points with all sorts of features, and the BYD charging speed. I mean, there's a whole lot of things behind it that add a lot of value to those vehicles. What's going to happen is that in the U.S., yes, for now we're not likely to get them in a tariff type of environment. But the tariff type environment may not last forever. It may not even last until the next presidency. The whole system might change. Obviously, there's the possibility, as you mentioned, that some of these Chinese vehicles could be built in a USMCA NAFTA country and then be imported into the US from those countries. Obviously, we wouldn't have the same price advantage, but would maintain a price advantage. There's also another option that could happen, right? We've seen that, for example, in Mexico, Dodge effectively rebadges a GAC Chinese vehicle there, right? Well, that could happen in the U.S. too. You could have a domestic branded vehicle that is effectively a rebadged Chinese vehicle that was already developed. All those costs have already been borne, and it may just be built in a NAFTA country, right? So, but the point is that when you have all of this technology that's coming down the line with better vehicles for a lower price point, it's hard not to imagine that the banks today, as well as the companies like ALG that are setting these residual value rates, they have to keep that in mind that this may be coming, and there's that risk that could bring down the future values of the EVs that exist today.
Right. So let me pick up on that a little bit further, Dan, for you. As an OEM person, right, we saw OEMs adding EV brands, Leaf, right, good example. But beyond that, right, whole kind of groups of EVs, GM, of course, the same thing, all kinds of different brands. And then there's the standalone EV brands, right? Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, these kinds of companies that are EV only, and the legacy OEMs are competing with the EV onlys, and they're all trying to do that. So, if we kind of set aside the possibility that another market like China may bring a bunch of new brands in, there's already a bunch of new brands in the United States, right, in terms of EVs and EV models. What do you see the industry, the OEMs wrestling with as they deal with that, and therefore how they market their EVs, right, and therefore price their EVs ultimately, right? How do you see that kind of affecting the industry?
It's been a really interesting journey to now look back and rewatch with the benefit of hindsight. As Genevieve was mentioning, this pay up front for the power that you want to have just in case in your EV. And that's why the Leaf has grown from 85 miles range to a 250-mile range, and a new model coming this fall that'll probably have even more range. So there has been this growth in capability. At the same time, and just thinking about the range itself, that the batteries have gotten better, the motors have gotten better. They're able to provide more range. They're able to do it more efficiently with less weight per mile of range. They're able to deliver less cost per mile. But the battery is still really expensive. It still is the single most expensive component system within an electric vehicle. And with the hope of things like solid state batteries or the other new lithium combination that you mentioned, George, the hope is that over time, those costs will also come down, because what has happened to most OEMs is they've had to put the EVs in premium products. You can't just sell a 20,000, 30,000 entry model and be profitable as an OEM. You can rely somewhat on federal credits and subsidies to help cover your profit needs or sell emissions credits and things like that. But in the long term, you need to be able to have a viable business where you can generate more revenue than your cost. And that has pushed almost all the OEMs to have above average prices for their EVs, at least as the starting point. That's led to an affordability issue, and it limits your market potential, all those kind of challenges. So I think what you'll see in the future will be other companies like Slate that are coming out with a $25,000 vehicle, strips out as much other content as they can from that car or that pickup truck SUV in order to deliver something that still has reasonable range, but is at a price point that is very attractive to a new car buyer. And you don't have this, upward pressure on pricing to be profitable. But that's not going to be the overwhelming volume of brands in the US market. What will need to happen is that the costs of delivering the service, the EV service, will need to come down overall. So battery technology needs to continue to innovate, get better. The supply chain needs to become shorter and less reliant on countries where there could be a very high tariff placed on it or a potential embargo on shipping components to the US. And that will allow EVs to sort of reach an equilibrium where they can compete head to head at all price points with gas powered vehicles. You've seen that happen with hybrids. And when hybrids first came out, there was a big price premium for those. And many thought in the early 2000s that they would never be at price parity with gas powered vehicles. They now are. And it took a couple decades to get there, and it'll probably take around that amount of time for EVs to get to the same place.
Yeah, agreed. And just to mention, if we have time for a couple of questions from the audience, if you want to put your questions in chat, Dan Teeter will be kind enough to curate those, and we'll try to answer them. Let me move to maybe a last couple questions from us. I'm just thinking about the idea of residual values and who benefits from higher residual values and who benefits, if anyone, from lower residual values, right? So higher residual values it sounds like to me, they would lower the monthly payment. Therefore, the average consumer would have an easier time accessibly getting the vehicle. But lower residual values might benefit somebody. Does anybody benefit with lower EV residual values? Maybe Cap or Alan?
Yeah, sure. I can come. I mean, the obvious one is the future used car buyer, right? So as residual values may go down on EVs or stay low, however you want to look at it, that opens the door for buyers that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford that vehicle, right? I mean, there's a natural floor for EV values. EVs have this natural, value proposition to them, right? The fact that you can save on fuel prices because more or less electricity is less expensive per mile than gasoline,
Sure.
right? So you have some, and then those maintenance type of advantages that Dan and Alan alluded to earlier. I mean, there's reasons why an EV has a value proposition. And that creates a floor, right? So the buyers that want to get into an EV, but probably perhaps may not feel that they can afford a brand new one, or maybe not have the credit to be able to lease a brand new one. It opens the door for them. So there are winners out there for that, even though there are, of course, a lot of people on the other end of that as well, other side of
Okay,
that.
good. All right, and of course, higher residual values, I think, are what most are going for, right? As we said earlier, when they're trying to introduce vehicles. I'm just curious about how the slate is going to happen, right? What is going to happen with that? It's a low-priced EV. What happens as it comes out into the market? What's the value going to be? And then we have this, as we said earlier, situation where specific brands like Tesla with the Cybertruck have this issue right now where they have too many unsold vehicles, forecast not as high as they wanted to, cost as high as the vehicle itself, driving all kinds of different issues here. Okay, and then any other thoughts about the way that we kind of determine EV values and relative to other vehicles at retail. Equity, Cap mentioned equity, and Alan, I think you mentioned equity actually. People having kind of being upside down, right? They're in a long-term loan, et cetera. I'm just thinking about these used EVs and the used EV market. 10% of the new market now is EVs, so that means there's going to be at some point 10% of the used market, right? It's also EVs competing with regular vehicles. And assuming that the range is good enough, right? You have a 300-mile range in a new vehicle. Maybe it's a 200-mile range as a used vehicle on the worst case. That's still pretty good. It's still very convenient, as pointed out, Genevieve pointed out, right? You don't need to pay for gas, et cetera. So cost of ownership. How do you see that kind of happening, the used car EV market in the US? How do you see that happening, Alan?
Obviously, the Tesla Cybertruck is an unusual one, but as we saw over the weekend, many of those are losing over 40% of their value in year one, whereas the traditional vehicle, it's closer to less than 20%. So, that will have a tendency to scare some people away from this newer technology. Which again, the leasing does solve that, and that is the reason that's such a high percentage of EVs have been leased, is people are worried about what that residual value is. They don't want the risk, and they'll let it sit with the manufacturer or the captive finance company.
Right.
So we've certainly seen that. But yes, as values do come down on, it's supply and demand, people will move there, and they'll start out with the used vehicle. And what we are seeing is most customers that drive an EV, they like it. They like the torque, they like the pickup, they like the ability to be able to charge at home overnight and not need to. Yes, everyone's worried about that couple of times a year they go on the long trip, but for 90+% of their driving, they never have to go to a dealer, a gas station, or to recharge. They really like that. So I do think that the penetration, as Genevieve has said, has been a little bit slower of late, but I do think eventually it will come as we get to scale. The pricing is there, the range is there, the charging infrastructure is there, the speed of charging is there. We'll start to see much higher penetrations.
Got it. And
can I just jump in there for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
As far as we've talked about that the values, obviously residual value, or what the used car market looks like, is a function of tangible and intangible elements, right? And there's a lot of, I think, I'm just going to say there's a lot of sort of anxiety churning out there, trying to increase consumers' concerns about that. How long does that battery last, right? And I think that is being priced into these vehicles, and I think in the end it redounds to the benefit of the market, because in the same way as with hybrids, those batteries lasted longer, performed way better than anybody anticipated, so that an initial depression in prices, I think, is going to actually build the market and show how good and how much longer lived these batteries actually are.
No, that's really important. I think in my experience, I had a couple of teenage kids that needed a car, and we looked at a used Prius, and it had 200,000 miles on it. It was incredible, and it worked just fine. So these cars can go a lot longer than people predict, I think. I want to just do a shout out to Kaysen. Thank you for posting about Slate. This was our question about what's their residual value going to be. I think you're spot on that people are going to jump in it, and then they're going to go, where's the radio, and all these other problems, and we'll see how that.
What's this hand crank on the door?
Yeah,
for?
what's this hand crank? I know. I couldn't believe anybody did that again. Okay, we only have about 30 seconds left. Any final comments from anyone on our panel about EVs, EV residual values, general feedback? Anything?
Right. I think Alan brought up a good point in that EVs bring other values that many gas products haven't. for the comparably sized car, the exterior dimensions, you have more interior room in an EV typically than you do in a gas car. Whether it's a EV or some of the plug-in hybrid vehicles, you have the ability of transferring your power back to the grid or back to your house if your power is out. Can't do that very easily or at all with a gas-powered vehicle. So some of those additional values that Genevieve mentioned, I think will become more commonplace and drive further adoption. But offsetting that, the US is a huge country, long distances. Some powertrain technologies are better than others at long distances, heavy applications. So I don't see there ever being a world where there's one powertrain in the US. We're going to be a mix of options.
Yeah, I think you're right. So thank you very much, everybody. We're at time. Really appreciate you joining. Really appreciate the discussion. Thank you, panelists. Really interesting. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And again, thank you for joining. Take care.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.